Hi, guys. I'm going to talk to you today about the second to last text on our course, our selection from Immanuel Kant's Critique of Judgment, dating to 1790. So we are back kind of in an imitation philosophy class, let's say, again, with this next few lectures. As you know, we've spent a lot of time in this course on the history and principles of literary criticism, actually in the company of philosophers, and that has been for several more or less obvious reasons, one of which, as you know, is that really is where serious thinking about the phenomenon of literature begins historically, at least in what we vaguely call the Western tradition. And by that token, if we are, as we have been trying to in this course, to give ourselves an historical grounding in this discipline of thinking about the phenomenon of literature, well, we can't do that, I think, without having an encounter with Plato, with Plato's discussion of the phenomenon of mimesis. We can't do that without learning about the Aristotelian theory of catharsis, and in much the same way, I would argue, and obviously am insisting, we can't give ourselves the historical grounding that we're trying to give in this course without learning something about Kant's critique of judgment, without learning something about Kantian aesthetics. And that's really going to be the key term for us over the next few lectures, aesthetics. And you'll hear me use that term in various combinations and formulations. I'll talk about the aesthetic idea. We'll talk about aesthetic consciousness. And this general idea or general approach, general way of thinking about the phenomena of art and literature in the broadest way is exceedingly important, I would say, in the history of our thing. We can happily, I think, we can give a brief sketch or definition, if you like, of what's involved in the aesthetic idea very quickly and easily, actually. And one reason we can do that is because this is precisely not an exotic idea. It's an idea that we will tend to find quite familiar. But certainly one thing that we want to become aware of is that it is a way, let's say, of thinking about the nature and the purpose of art and literature, a way as opposed to the way. So what's aesthetics? What's the aesthetic idea? Well, it is the idea or the assumption that art is there to be beautiful. That's what it's for. Art or literature. So that answers part of the question that hangs over our course. What is it good for? What is it for? What is it good for? Well, it is good for being beautiful. That is what art, in the broadest sense, is supposed to do, according to the aesthetic idea. Moreover, in the encounter with beauty, under this aesthetic heading or aesthetic consciousness, in the encounter with beauty, what happens, what we experience, how this beauty thing, so to speak, manifests itself is through pleasure. Art is there to be beautiful, according to aesthetics. When we encounter the beautiful, we have an experience of pleasure. And one may or may not, so to speak, in aesthetics, then take the next step and say, well, art is there to give you pleasure. Kant, I would say, does not exactly take that step, but certainly later aesthetic thinkers do. And accordingly, in this aesthetic idea, art or literature is very much not an intellectual thing. It's not about seeking knowledge or acquiring any special kind of knowledge. You will recall several weeks ago we saw Sir Philip Sidney in the late 16th century, on the one hand, ringingly insisting that poetry was a special kind of knowledge. On the other hand, struggling ever to kind of explain what kind of knowledge that was. In aesthetics, the knowledge idea, the intellectual idea of what art or literature is basically for, that's really thrown away. Instead, what you have is again, the idea of a search for beauty and an encounter with beauty as more or less self-justified, good just on its face or for its own sake. And in that encounter with beauty, if you are lucky enough to find some, you experience pleasure. And that, as it were, is the whole ball of wax in the aesthetic tradition. So aesthetics constitutes a kind of hedonism, so a theory of pleasure, not, to be sure, quite the kind of hedonism that you may pursue in a restaurant or at the beach or other places of physical satisfaction. But nonetheless, aesthetics, under aesthetic consciousness, our encounter with art is to be explained in terms of a kind of psychological hedonism. So we're getting pleasure, albeit it's a kind of pleasure that mostly occurs in our minds rather than in other parts of ourselves. And there is no question, historically speaking, that the aesthetic idea with the whole kind of hedonistic apparatus that it entails became totally dominant, certainly in the culture of the English language, but I think in other European cultures too, totally dominant from the later 18th century on. The Romantic poets, who just have a huge influence on the whole profile and understanding of art in modernity. The Romantic poets are foursquare into this hedonistic view, this non-intellectual view of what poetry is for. And I would certainly argue that from then until now, we have had an awareness, a theory, a set of assumptions about art and literature in our culture, in the culture of the modern developed world, which is, if not overwhelmingly, at least powerfully aesthetic. By which I simply mean the ideas that we're learning about here, with the help of Kant and a couple others, as we'll see, are ideas that remain kind of basic assumptions in our society about what art and literature are for. So they are, if you like, unexamined ideas. That is the status that they have taken on since the late 18th century. And accordingly, we actually have an opportunity, which I consider to be potentially a very, very productive opportunity, to examine some of these unexamined ideas a little bit critically, maybe. Now, as you guys will already know, if you have started the readings with Kant, we are, so to speak, in deep trouble with Kant, those of us who are not professional philosophers, because he really is, by common consent, the greatest philosopher since Aristotle, and certainly one of the most important voices, figures in the whole philosophical tradition. And what that means, frankly, is that reading Kant is really hard. This is a very smart man, and an exceedingly careful, thorough, patient, comprehensive, and precise thinker. And those of us who spend most of our time, in the world of English literature, we're a bit less intellectually rigorous than that, let's say. So it can be a bit of a shock. For that reason, Yes, I forgot to mute the phone up here before I started this. Very dumb. Partly for that reason, I want to actually begin our discussion of Kant and of aesthetics with somebody else. And this is the brief reading that I added to the Canvas page by a man named Walter Pater, a Victorian critic named Walter Pater. And the text that I gave you a little bit of it was from his preface to a book that he published in 1873 on Renaissance art. It's just called Studies in the Renaissance. Pater's preface is a famous little text in its own right, and what it does for our purposes is give us a very quick and I think very effective glimpse, if you like, of the aesthetic idea, this psychological hedonist idea of beautiful art and the pleasure in art in its full flower. And so I actually want to begin just by looking at a bit of Pater with you. I'm going to read a little bit from the excerpt that I gave you. It's just a brief reading. I'm going to start with the second paragraph. This is Walter Pater, the arch aesthetic critic of Victorian England, explaining to us what art is for and what criticism is for. I'm going to read from the second paragraph in the excerpt that I gave you, where Pater writes, "To see the object as in itself it really is has been justly said to be the aim of all true criticism whatever. And in aesthetic criticism, the first step towards seeing one's object as it really is to know one's own impression as it really is, to discriminate it, to realize it distinctly. The objects with which aesthetic criticism deals, music, poetry, artistic and accomplished forms of human life, are indeed receptacles of so many powers or forces. They possess, like the products of nature, so many virtues or qualities. What is this song or picture, this engaging personality presented in life or in a book, to me? What effect does it really produce on me? Does it give me pleasure? And if so, what sort or degree of pleasure? How is my nature modified by its presence and under its influence? The answers to these questions are the original facts with which the aesthetic critic has to do. And, as in a study of light, of morals, of number, one must realize such primary data for oneself, or not at all." And just before commenting, I want to skip down to the beginning of the next paragraph, which begins with the words "the aesthetic critic." So Pater goes on. "The aesthetic critic, then, regards all the objects with which he has to do, all works of art, and the fairer forms of nature and human life, as powers or forces producing pleasurable sensations, each of a more or less peculiar or unique kind. This influence he feels and wishes to explain, analyzing it and reducing it to its elements. To him, the aesthetic critic, to him, the picture, the landscape, the engaging personality in life or in a book, La Gioconda, the hills of Carrara, Pico of Mirandola, are valuable for their virtues, as we say, in speaking of a herb, a wine, a gem, for the property each has of affecting one with a special, a unique impression of pleasure. Our education becomes complete in proportion as our susceptibility to these impressions increases in depth and variety. And the function of the aesthetic critic is to distinguish, analyze, and separate from its adjuncts the virtue by which a picture, a landscape, a fair personality in life or in a book produces this special impression of beauty or pleasure, to indicate what the source of that impression is and under what conditions it is experienced. His end is reached when he has disengaged that virtue and noted it as a chemist notes some natural element for himself and others." I'm going to stop there. That incredible, and to me, as it were, creepy passage from Walter Pater, the great Victorian aesthete. So for Pater, writing, as I said, when the aesthetic idea is absolutely in full flow in late 19th century English society and culture. For Pater, it simply goes without saying that the purpose of art of any kind is to be beautiful, and the purpose of that beauty is to produce pleasure. The aesthetic critic in Pater's, again, somewhat creepy Victorian vision, the aesthetic critic is first of all, well, and after all, for Pater, that really just means the critic. He keeps saying aesthetic critic, but that's what criticism is as far as Pater is concerned. The critic is first of all somebody who is just very, very good at experiencing this pleasure. He's a kind of connoisseur of aesthetic pleasure, even in that wonderful analogy that Pater gives at the end of that passage that I read. The critic is almost like a scientist of pleasure, analyzing the different degrees and shapes of pleasure that this or that work gives you, and extracting from the work its special virtue. So, the artwork as fundamentally a site of producing pleasure through beauty. The artist as somebody who is just extraordinarily gifted at creating expressions, things, works that will produce pleasure in those who consume them, and the critic as the learned specialist of pleasure. And wow, the jokes almost write themselves, but certainly one can imagine some pretty fun funding applications coming out of that kind of attitude that Pater is sharing with us. Okay, that, as I said, that's a kind of introductory sketch of what aesthetics is, and with Pater, we get a very quick look at where the aesthetic attitude or aesthetic consciousness goes, where it leads to. We want, though, to talk about where it comes from. Where does this aesthetic attitude originate? Well, it does not quite originate with Kant, that's for sure. As we saw last week, at least part of the aesthetic idea, the idea of literature as fundamentally being there to produce pleasure, that idea already seems to be immanent or emergent, apparent. That idea already seems to be there, a simpler word, in Samuel Johnson. And as I said last week, it isn't clear to me, at least, where that idea actually comes from in the history of human culture. And Kant is already himself assuming a lot of what he's talking about in terms of aesthetic terminology and the aesthetic purpose of beautiful works of art. But what Kant does in the Critique of Judgment is precisely to codify, to articulate, explain, systematize the aesthetic idea in what really becomes its most advanced, definitive form for the Enlightenment, the Romantic period, and beyond. Generally speaking, as those of you who our philosophy students will know, generally speaking, we talk about Kant as having a critical philosophy, which means that his work does not so much consist in inventing or formulating novel concepts, but rather in codifying, clarifying, explaining, interrelating, clearing up concepts that are already there. And that is certainly what he's doing in the text that we are reading. He's giving us his best effort, not to give us the aesthetic idea, because that's already there, but rather to make sense of the aesthetic idea. As I said, in a almost horrendously careful, detailed, precise, systematic way. Okay, that brings us up to the point of actually now beginning to open up Kant and try to deal with what he's telling us in this text, the Critique of Judgment. I don't want to rush this. And so I want to begin by contextualizing this work the Critique of Judgment that we're reading within the overall ambit of Kant's mature philosophy, because I think it is a very, very interesting intellectual story, and really one of the biggest of such stories that there have ever been. And one detail that I like very much, Kant lived a long and in some ways very uneventful life, evidently never straying farther than about 50 kilometers from his home in the then Prussian city of Königsberg. But just an incredible philosophical mind, and he's best known. His reputation is what it is because of these three works that he wrote. These three critiques, which constitute what we can call Kant's mature philosophy. And fun fact, which is probably more fun for me than it is for you guys, Kant did not begin working on this program, his mature philosophical program, until he was, I believe, in his mid-50s. I mean, very good. Thank you, Kant. Okay, the context for the Critique of Judgment, what the heck Kant is trying to achieve, because actually he is trying to achieve something that is both focused and systematic and huge. Kant's mature philosophy, his whole project, is epistemological in the strongest, strictest sense of that word. It's epistemological. It's a project in epistemology, the theory of knowledge, what knowledge is, how we know what we know, how we can know that what we know is really knowledge, that kind of thing. And above all, for our purposes, as we have this encounter with the critique of judgment, the powerfully epistemological question that Kant is trying to answer and resolve, and which he certainly feels he is answering and resolving once and for all. The question is how we can know that what we call knowledge is knowledge of the actual, real, existing world, okay? Rather than, for example, knowledge of a fantasy, or knowledge of a deception, or knowledge of a kind of dream, or anything like that. How can we be sure that the knowledge we call knowledge is protected from any kind of corrosive skepticism? Not just an arbitrary system of ideas, but actual knowledge of the real world where we indeed find ourselves. And again, a very, very interesting story in the history of ideas, one of the most important such stories there have ever been, because the background to Kant's work, and so I'm going to expatiate just a little bit maybe for 5 or 10 minutes on this, because I think we need this background in order to understand what the heck Kant is trying to achieve. The background for Kant's work in this respect is really the rise of modern natural science, beginning in the later 17th century. By the mid-18th century, it was totally apparent to interested, learned people that something really big had happened in the recent world. The emergence of this whole set of experimental practices and mathematical practices that we call scientific. And it was totally apparent that these practices were A, massively impressive, and B, totally transformative, changing the world in various ways. And yet, from a philosophical point of view, it began to seem like there was a kind of a problem, because how could you show that scientific knowledge was really as well-grounded and as certain as it claimed to be and kind of needed to be? And we can't get too far into this, but there's a couple of just sort of classic conundra here, one of which has to do with the very logic of experiment, that makes science so powerful. Going to sea, trying it out, testing the world itself to see how the world will behave, and building up scientific principles from multiple instances of how the world behaves. And although we don't need this word, if we wanted to, we could identify that whole business as consistent with a logic of induction. So, building up scientific principles from specific instances of how the world behaves, instances which are derived through experiment. Now, that's what we vaguely call the scientific method, and of course, it's incredibly powerful. Logically or philosophically speaking, however, it began to seem like there was kind of a problem, which is, well, if you're testing the world to see how it behaves, and your knowledge is based on, examples 1 through 100 of how the world behaves, how do you know how the world will behave in example 101? Well, it's very difficult to bridge that gap, actually, precisely because you're going to the world as a scientist, right? And saying, show me what you got. Precisely because it's the world who is showing you. The world could always show you something different. There can always be a contrary instance, to put it in a slightly more formal way. And philosophically, it began to appear that it was very, very difficult to explain that away, kind of. And the other classic example of an epistemological problem in the emergence of modern science had to do with abstract categories that are used and assumed by scientists to direct their work. Categories like time and space, those would be the two biggies. Science, again, is supposed to be all about building up knowledge from these specific empirical instances, these specific instances of observation. Well, how do you get something like time as a category or a concept from that? Well, you can't. How do you get space? Well, you can't. You're actually assuming these categories, these ideal categories, we might say, time and space, which seemed to put science in a kind of situation of, let's say, epistemological hypocrisy, because they're not supposed to be about abstract or ideal entities. They're supposed to be about hard, fast observation. Okay, that is enough for that bit of our background. We just want to sketch that in very briefly. And one last little really wonderful bit in this story before we move on has to do with Kant's immediate philosophical predecessor, who was the Scottish philosopher David Hume. Hume spent a long, long time trying to work out these epistemological problems in modern natural science. And in the end, he says wonderfully, I can't really tell you why science makes sense, Hume says. Makes sense to me, and that's enough. That was Hume's way of dealing with that problem, and that is actually an attitude to the work of epistemology that has returned really very forcefully in recent times. Nonetheless, for Immanuel Kant in Königsberg, for Immanuel Kant, it was intolerable that there could not be a really satisfactory, comprehensive, finalized epistemological account of why science was correct, why math was correct. For Kant, we had to be able to show that our knowledge, insofar as it seemed certain to us, was indeed certain, was indeed knowledge of the natural world, the actual existing world. And in order to prove that, Kant wrote these three very long, very tough, very brilliant, very powerful philosophical works called critiques. First, the critique of pure reason, followed by the critique of practical reason, and finally, the text from which we are reading a tiny bit. And believe me, a tiny bit is all that I can guide us through with Kant. Finally, the critique of judgment, dating to 1790. Um, this is the last of Kant's three great critiques, these works that make up his mature philosophical program. And it is, at least for the for the uh, for the way of reading Kant with which I'm familiar, um, the Critique of Judgment is actually the definitive or final work in Kant's epistemology. So we've been operating so far today at a fairly challenging philosophical level. We can summarize up a lot of it just by saying that in one way, for Kant, the question of art is an epistemological question. Okay? And actually, the theory he's going to give of aesthetics, the attempt that he's going to make sense of aesthetics, is supposed to function in the last analysis epistemologically. It's crucial to the project of Kant's epistemology that aesthetics work this way, the way that he is going to describe. Paradoxically, however, and for reasons that we'll see, one thing that is absolutely essential to Kant's aesthetics in its epistemological role is that there actually be no knowledge, no conceptual knowledge involved in the encounter with art at all, art or natural beauty. And as we'll see, natural beauty is actually more important even to Kant than artistic beauty. For Kant, it is essential to our knowledge, it's essential to epistemology that art be there to be beautiful, and that the beautiful be there to produce pleasure, and that we encounter pleasure, we experience pleasure in the encounter with beautiful things. That's what Kant calls the judgment of taste. The judgment of taste is when we see or encounter or taste or hear something. Well, let's just focus maybe on sight, because that keeps it relatively simple. The judgment of taste is when we see something that is worthy of the judgment of taste. And that's going to mean for Kant, first of all, things like flowers, and then maybe landscapes, and then abstract decorative schemes, and then visual art. The judgment of taste is when we see something like that and we say, that's beautiful. We are moved to say, that's beautiful. Kant's whole epistemology, in the end, depends on that moment when we say, that's beautiful. Which is a pretty amazing idea, I think. And believe it or not, I think we can actually get a handle on this basic idea that Kant has relatively quickly. And that's what I want to do. I want to sketch Kant's idea, summarize it, if you like, and then we'll turn to the text and we'll go through it in greater detail. But let's do the sketch first, because really, as I said, I think it is a very, very cool thing, just an astonishing idea that Kant has. And the epistemological role for aesthetics in Kant works something like this. As I said, Kant wants to show and prove and enforce and make us agree that when we think we have knowledge of something, we indeed do, if it's gone through the appropriate procedures that allow it to be called knowledge. And it is indeed knowledge of the actual world. We can and do have concepts that we grasp and understand, and they are concepts that actually relate to and map onto and are determined by, whatever formulation you want, the actually existing world around us, as opposed to any kind of fantasy that we are maybe existing within. The problem that Kant has in his philosophy is that knowledge is knowing, the activity of knowing. That's more or less by definition something that we do, right? And to put that in slightly more philosophical terms, that is an activity of our will. When we know some aspect of the world, that's us reaching out to the world, reaching out and grabbing it in some way. What we need in Kant to make sure that that reaching out to the world really is reaching the world, and that we really are in the world rather than any kind of skeptical fantasy. What we need is some kind of moment in which the world reaches back to us, precisely without our will. You see? We need there to be a moment where it's not our doing, our concepts, our thinking, our constructing of things, but rather where the world responds, the world reciprocates, reaches out and kind of taps us on the shoulder. And if and when that happens, or we can show that that happens, Kant thinks, that shows that we actually are in the world. Because we're not doing that. You see what I mean? The world is doing that when it reaches back to us. And that, for Kant, is precisely what happens when we have the experience of beauty, when we come into the presence of a beautiful object. And this is why, a point that we will come back to, like most of these points, this is why Kant's aesthetics, actually, in the first place, as we'll see, is focused on natural beauty, because natural beauty is the beauty of the world. We may have, let's say, all kinds of ideas about, well, let's say daffodils. An example not chosen at random, of course, but chosen because of the famous Wordsworth poem, which I've also added to the Canvas page. Let's say we have all kinds of ideas about daffodils. We have all kinds of scientific ideas about daffodils, what kind of flower they are, what genus they belong to, horticultural ideas about daffodils, all conceptually informed. What helps daffodils grow, what season they tend to come up in, what is bad for daffodils, what's good for daffodils. We may even have sort of Pinteresty ideas about daffodils. Not a concept that was available to Kant, the concept of Pinterest, but actually I would have loved to hear what Kant would say about Pinterest. We may have, you know what I'm saying, the kind of, well, daffodils look really nice in that window nook on spring mornings, that kind of thing. But these are all ideas about daffodils, which is to say that this conceptual engagement with these flowers, that's us reaching out to them, our will reaching out to them, our knowledge reaching out to them. What we need to seal the deal, so to speak, epistemologically, is for the daffodils to reach out to us. And that, in Kant, is precisely what happens if, like Wordsworth, we find ourselves walking by a lake, and without even quite realizing what's happening, we are suddenly going, ah, beautiful daffodils! We have an encounter, an experience of beauty, which precisely happens to us, which the world as itself gives us. And for Kant, in that moment, epistemology is secured. We are in the actual world. And we know that because the world just reached out and tapped us on the shoulder. Or to use another metaphor, the world just reached out and kind of, rang our bell. Without our asking it to do that, without our willing it to do that, without our being able to stop it from doing that. That sudden moment of pleasure in the presence of beauty, that for Kant has this incredible epistemological value. And that is the idea that he sets out to explicate through his whole aesthetics. there's just one more idea that we can add on to our summary before we do a little bit of work with the text itself, and then we'll have to wrap up this first lecture. As I've said, in Kantian aesthetics, it's the world reaching out to us. That's what natural beauty is. We experience that pleasure in the presence of natural beauty precisely because we are in the world. As for the artist in Kant, well, as for art in Kant, art is very much to be understood in Kant as an imitation or a mimesis, we might say, of natural beauty. So art is copying that. And as for the artist in Kant, Kant has an amazing and just an incredibly famous and influential theory of what an artist is. The artist, the true artist, is the kind of person that Kant calls a genius, which means somebody who is really born, not made. And the genius in Kantian aesthetics is precisely somebody who is just really, really good at responding to the beauty of nature and kind of channeling it, so to speak. The genius, the true artist in Kant, is the child of nature through whom nature speaks. And so we have, and I hope you will hear the echoes of certainly romantic poetry, of Wordsworth, of Coleridge, and we can have a lot of fun with the genius idea, the artistic genius idea in the history of culture since the early 19th century, and actually even before that, since the mid to late 18th century, let's say. Mozart being a classic example. It is also, of course, the genius idea in Kant, as I hope you guys will notice, is also something that is situated very much in the heritage of the Platonic idea of divinely inspired madness or furor, with which we are familiar. Okay, that's the sketch, the summary of the Kantian idea. Now we have a few minutes left in this first lecture. I don't want to rush Kant, as I said. I don't want to overburden us either. But if we could just have 5 more minutes to dip our toes, let's say, in the text, I think that would be worth our while. And I'm going to proceed in a very uncreative and perhaps plodding manner, but I think it is indicated and even required for a text like this. I'm going to be reading some selections from our PDF and then commenting on them, and I think we'll just have time to get through probably one of them. And I want to begin from the beginning. We're beginning in our PDF. It's page 89, and in terms of the way Kant breaks down the text, we are in what he calls the first moment of his argument, where he's describing the nature of the judgment of taste. Remember, the judgment of taste, that's what Kant, by that Kant means the moment when you see something like a flower or a painting or a landscape, and you go, that's beautiful. He wants to explain the quality or nature of the judgment of taste. Section 1, the judgment of taste is aesthetic. There's a very cool and very strange and also very kind of irritating thing that goes on a lot in Kant. I said that he's not inventing concepts. He's not. He's clarifying them. And he certainly is coming to the table, so to speak, on which aesthetics is already arranged. And yet part of what that means in Kant is that in a number of cases, the concepts that he wants to kind of enforce are already there, already kind of assumed in almost a circular way in his argument. That is a little bit annoying, I have to say, but I mean, he's Kant, so I think we'll go with it because he knows what he's doing. He really does. Okay, section 1, the judgment of taste is aesthetic. Kant begins as follows. He says, in order to decide whether or not something is beautiful, we do not relate the representation by means of understanding to the object for cognition, but rather relate it by means of the imagination, perhaps combined with the understanding, to the subject and its feeling of pleasure or displeasure. The judgment of taste is therefore not a cognitive judgment, hence not a logical one, but is rather aesthetic, by which is understood one whose determining ground cannot be other than subjective. Now, I gave you guys a page on Kantian terms. I don't want to spend too much time on them here. But basically, when Kant talks about the object, he means something that we see out there in the world. When he talks about cognition, that means knowing, conceptual knowing. The subject in Kant, that means the knower, the person, the human being moving through the world. And what he's saying in this very characteristic and certainly very dense opening paragraph is of his discussion is that the judgment of taste, the moment when we call something beautiful, is not, let's say, an empirical claim or even a scientific claim about the nature of the object or the phenomenon that we are calling beautiful. So when we say that's beautiful, Kant is claiming, we're not actually making any claims about that object at all. Not really. Rather, we're making a claim about ourselves. We're making a claim about our own experience. So Kant is telling us at the very beginning of his discussion that the judgment of taste, saying, that's beautiful, that is actually a statement about our own experience, an experience that we are having. And this is an experience of what Kant calls satisfaction. In other words, being pleased. Which, as Kant says somewhat later, comes under the name of pleasure or displeasure. So, saying that's beautiful is not an objective statement. It is purely subjective in the sense that it is a statement about this special, indeed unique experience that we are having. Now, as I've said today, Kant's aesthetics is supposed to be the kind of final piece or the linchpin in his epistemology. It's supposed to provide the fundamental ground for our knowledge, proving that we are having experiences in the actual world. And it may strike us in that sense as very strange from the beginning that Kant begins from this insistence of pure subjectivity in the judgment of taste. How can we get from pure subjectivity to some kind of universal grounding of knowledge? Kant believes that we can do that. In fact, he thinks we have to proceed in this way. What he's going to go on to argue is that the experience of beauty the experience of pleasure in the presence of beauty that we express in the judgment of taste, yes, it's purely subjective, and yet it is universally subjective. So all people have this same kind of experience, Kant says, in the presence of that kind of object, a truly beautiful object that occasions a judgment of taste. Putting it that way may do very little to make us lower our eyebrows, so to speak, at this point with Kant. But what he's going to go on to do in the next bit of the text, which I'll talk about next time, what he's going to go on to do in a way that is very, very acute, very sharp, is to distinguish between the experience of the beautiful, strictly speaking, and two other kinds of experience of satisfaction or pleasure. One which Kant calls the agreeable, the experience of the agreeable, and the other which he calls the experience of the good. And he's going to try to distinguish the experience of the beautiful from both of those by way of showing that even though all of these experiences are subjective, the beautiful is so subjective, so to speak, that it in effect becomes universal. not objective for the thing, for the object. You still know nothing about those daffodils. And in fact, Kant actually needs to insist in a way that becomes quite, I think, paradoxical. Kant needs to insist that we can't know anything about those daffodils in the experience of of finding them beautiful. So Kant's going to argue, to wrap up here, last 30 seconds. The experience of the beautiful is so subjective it becomes universal, by which he does not mean that we learn anything or claim anything or know anything about those daffodils. Rather, Kant means and is claiming that we have an experience that we share universally with all other human beings. The experience of the beautiful as distinguishable from the agreeable and the good, which we do not necessarily share with all human beings, not in the way that we experience those things anyway. Okay, that brings us up to the beginning of our fairly detailed work with Kant's text. I'm going to stop there. Next time I'll be going on to talk about Kant's distinction between the beautiful, the agreeable, and the good, and some other stuff that comes along after that. Okay, thank you very much, as always, for watching, you guys.